Before we begin, an important note. This video is a documentary focused on history, investigation, and prevention. It does not glorify violence, and it does not describe graphic details. The purpose of this story is to understand how such crimes happen, how they remain hidden for years, and how they are ultimately stopped. Viewer discretion is advised. For decades, the city of Wichita, Kansas believed it was dealing with a ghost, not because the killer was invisible, but because he chose when to appear. He didn't chase attention constantly, he controlled it. He wrote letters, he disappeared, and when the world began to forget him, he returned, just long enough to remind everyone that he was still there. This is the story of BTK, a story not about brilliance or mystery, but about ego, patience, and a fatal misunderstanding of time. In the mid-1970s, Wichita was not a city that expected fear. It was quiet, predictable, comfortable. Neighborhoods looked the same from block to block. People knew their neighbors. Children rode bikes without supervision. Doors were locked at night, but they were not locked in panic. That sense of safety didn't vanish overnight. It cracked slowly, through rumors, through police reports that felt disconnected, through the growing realization that something wasn't right, even if no one could explain exactly what. Police were facing crimes that resisted easy categorization. There was no single location, no consistent schedule, no obvious suspect, and most unsettling of all, no clear emotional motive. This wasn't rage, it wasn't desperation, it was something colder. At some point, the killer decided anonymity was not enough. He wanted a name, not given by the media, not assigned by police, chosen. He called himself BTK, an acronym he included in letters sent to newspapers and law enforcement. The letters were not apologies, they were not confessions, they were declarations, attempts to shape the narrative, to frame fear as achievement, to turn attention into power. But behind the letters was not a legend. There was no criminal mastermind operating above society. There was simply a man who wanted control. Control over how he was seen, control over when he existed, control over the silence that followed him. What made the case especially disturbing was how little he stood out. No erratic behavior, no public breakdowns, no visible signs of instability. From the outside, he looked ordinary, and that ordinariness was his greatest advantage. At the time, investigations moved slowly. There were no digital shortcuts, no searchable databases, no instant cross-referencing of evidence. Detectives relied on interviews, on paper records, on memory, and memory fades. Witnesses move away, details blur, leads dry up. As years passed, the case didn't disappear, it dissolved. By the early 1990s, BTK had gone silent. No letters, no messages, no taunts. For many, it felt like closure. For investigators, it felt unfinished. But without new information, there was nowhere to go. And so BTK became part of Wichita's past, or so it seemed. What no one knew was that the silence wasn't absence. It was waiting. Waiting for relevance, waiting for attention, waiting for a moment when being forgotten felt worse than being caught. By the early 2000s, the world had changed. Computers were no longer rare. Digital records were quietly replacing paper ones. Most people didn't think about it. BTK didn't think about it at all, and that would cost him everything. When BTK went silent in the early 1990s, many assumed the danger had passed. No new messages, no new signs, no attempts to reclaim attention. But silence did not mean remorse. It meant satisfaction. BTK believed he had won. The letters he sent in earlier years reveal far more than their surface meaning. They weren't written in panic. They weren't written to mislead. They were written to be read carefully, slowly, with the expectation of an audience. BTK didn't communicate to confuse police. He communicated to feel present, to insert himself into the investigation without being touched by it. Each letter was a reminder that he still existed, even when no one could find him. His language was calculated, detached, controlling, devoid of empathy. There was no curiosity about the people affected, only fixation on process, on how events unfolded, on how they were interpreted, on how much power he still held over fear itself. Psychologically, BTK wasn't driven by chaos. He was driven by structure. Routines mattered, rules mattered, control mattered. This wasn't impulsive violence, it was ritualized, and rituals don't disappear easily. They pause. For law enforcement, this created a unique problem. BTK wasn't leaving emotional signatures. He wasn't escalating publicly. He wasn't reacting to pressure. Without new evidence, the investigation entered a slow freeze. Files were archived. Leads went cold. Detectives rotated out. Not because they gave up, but because there was nowhere left to go. Years passed. Technology advanced. But the BTK case remained frozen in a pre-digital world. Paper records, old notes, fragmented memories, and no living suspect to confront. What investigators didn't know was that BTK was watching from the sidelines. He followed coverage quietly, tracked public memory, waited, and eventually something changed. He realized something terrifying. He was being forgotten. By the early 2000s, new crimes dominated headlines. New fears replaced old ones. BTK's name no longer carried weight. And to someone whose identity was built on recognition, that was unacceptable. In 2004, BTK decided to return, not with violence, with communication. Letters began arriving again. This time, they carried a different tone, less confidence, more urgency. He wasn't proving superiority anymore. He was demanding relevance. BTK believed the world was still playing by the old rules. He believed anonymity was permanent. He believed distance was protection. And most importantly, he believed technology worked the way it always had. His messages reached police and local media. They referenced past crimes, old details, enough to confirm authenticity. But something about them felt outdated, almost out of sync with the present. What BTK didn't understand was that the investigation had changed, even if he hadn't noticed. Police didn't respond impulsively. They didn't challenge him. They didn't provoke. They let him talk. Every message was treated as data, not emotionally, not theatrically, but patiently. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was exposure. Then BTK asked a question that revealed more than he intended. He wanted to know if information stored on a floppy disk could be traced. To him, it was a technical detail. To investigators, it was a signal. The question revealed two critical things. First, he trusted outdated technology. Second, he was willing to interact physically. That meant location. That meant risk. That meant a mistake was possible. Police responded carefully. They told him what he wanted to hear. That tracing a floppy disk wasn't possible. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. BTK believed he was still in control. That belief would lead him to cross a line he never had before, from words to objects. When the package arrived, investigators immediately understood what it meant. BTK had stepped into the physical world again, and physical objects leave trails, even when the sender believes they don't. Inside the package was a floppy disk, old, familiar, comforting. To BTK, it represented safety. To police, it represented opportunity. This wasn't about hacking. It wasn't about breaking encryption. It was about something far simpler. Routine. Every computer leaves behind traces, not because it wants to, but because it has to. File names, user data, metadata created automatically, without awareness, information that accumulates quietly. When analysts examined the disk, they didn't rush. They didn't speculate. They observed, and what they found pointed somewhere unexpected, not to a basement, not to a hidden workspace, not to a secret device, but to a shared computer in a public place, a church. At first, the results seemed almost absurd. A serial killer who styled himself as untouchable, connected to a church computer, but the data didn't lie. It pointed to a user account, and that account had a name. The name was Dennis Rader. At this stage, Rader was not a suspect, just a connection, a single thread. But for investigators, one thread was all they needed, because threads can be pulled. What followed wasn't a dramatic pursuit. It was patience, observation, verification. They began mapping timelines, comparing routines, matching movements. Rader lived in the right areas, he had access, and his daily life followed predictable patterns. Patterns that aligned too closely to ignore. Still, police didn't rush. They didn't confront him. They didn't alert the media. They watched, because once you confront someone like BTK, you only get one chance, and they weren't going to waste it. Once Dennis Rader's name appeared on the investigators' radar, everything slowed down. Not because they were uncertain, but because certainty requires confirmation, and confirmation takes time. Police began surveillance quietly. No marked cars, no visible pressure, just observation. They tracked routines, commutes, stops, habits, not to provoke, but to understand. Rader's life appeared structured, predictable. He went to work, he returned home, he participated in community activities. Nothing about him stood out. And that was exactly what made the situation dangerous. The more investigators watched, the clearer the pattern became. Rader didn't act randomly. His movements aligned with long gaps in the past, gaps that once seemed meaningless. Now they looked deliberate. Still, police waited, because suspicion alone isn't enough. What they needed was certainty, something that couldn't be explained away, something final. That certainty came quietly, through DNA, not taken from a crime scene, not extracted from something dramatic, but collected carefully through ordinary means. When the results came back, there was no ambiguity, no margin for interpretation. The identity BTK had hidden behind for decades collapsed instantly. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25, 2005, police made the arrest. There was no chase, no public spectacle. Rader was taken into custody during the middle of a normal day. For someone who believed control defined his existence, the lack of drama was devastating. In that moment, BTK ceased to exist. There were no letters, no aliases, no narrative to manage, only a man confronted with the end of his illusion. During interrogation, something unsettling emerged. Rader did not deny his actions. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He explained. His tone was calm, methodical, detached, as if describing procedures rather than acknowledging harm. Investigators noticed something unexpected. This wasn't fear. It was relief. The secret was gone. The performance was over. The control he had maintained for decades no longer required effort, and in its place was something hollow. For years, BTK believed he was smarter than the system. That time itself protected him. That silence made him invisible. That attention was power. But none of that was true. He wasn't manipulating the system. He was simply operating within its blind spots. And blind spots don't last forever. Technology didn't hunt BTK. It waited, quietly, patiently, until his assumptions became outdated. As details of the arrest became public, shock spread through Wichita. The image of a serial killer dissolved into something far more uncomfortable. A neighbor, a father, a man no one had questioned. People searched for signs they might have missed. Unusual behavior, subtle warnings. But there were none that stood out clearly, and that realization was unsettling. This wasn't a failure of awareness. It was a reminder of how easily normalcy can hide danger, how routine can become camouflage. In court, Dennis Rader chose to speak, not to express remorse, not to seek understanding, but to maintain control over the narrative. He described his crimes in a flat, emotionless manner, without visible regret, without empathy. The focus remained on himself, on the process, on ownership. There was no apology, only explanation. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. No parole, no possibility of release. The legal process ended, but the implications did not. The BTK case reshaped how law enforcement approached communication with offenders. No casual engagement, no unnecessary responses, no assumptions about anonymity. It reinforced the importance of patience, of restraint, of understanding that silence can be more powerful than confrontation. It also highlighted a critical truth. Technology doesn't need to be aggressive to be effective. It only needs time. BTK was not caught because police worked harder. He was caught because he couldn't stop talking, because attention mattered more than safety, because control mattered more than caution. This story is not about fear. It's about ego, about patience, and about how the smallest details, when observed long enough, can bring even the longest shadows into the light.